The 2026 Formula One regulations haven't even begun, and they're already being questioned. During pre-season testing in Bahrain, something became very clear. The new power unit philosophy might not behave the way Formula One expected. Drivers weren't just adjusting, they were actively managing energy in ways that looked unnatural. Lift and coast on push laps, aggressive battery harvesting, super clipping before corners. And now, behind closed doors, a contingency discussion is emerging. Before we break this down properly, make sure you subscribe to F1 Grid and turn on notifications, because the 2026 regulation cycle is shaping up to be the most politically and technically complex eras we've seen in years, and we'll be covering every development with full analysis. Let's start with the foundation. For 2026, Formula One is introducing a radically revised power unit concept. The MGU-H is gone. Electrical power increases significantly. The internal combustion engine will produce roughly 400 kilowatts, while the electrical side is capped at 350 kilowatts. That's nearly a 50-50 split in total power contribution, a dramatic shift compared to previous eras. On paper, it makes sense. Sustainable fuels, increased electrification, and a more road-relevant philosophy. But on track, reality is more complicated. In Bahrain testing, drivers reported heavy energy management requirements. Because the MGU-H has been removed, energy harvesting is now limited primarily to the rear axle MGU-K system. That means regeneration capacity is restricted compared to previous hybrid generations. So what happens? Drivers must lift earlier, coast longer, and allow regenerative braking to recharge the battery. In some cases, even during qualifying style laps, they're not flat out in the traditional sense, they're constantly managing state of charge. Fernando Alonso reportedly described the situation as feeling far from the limit in certain corners because of aggressive energy clipping. Others echoed similar concerns, not necessarily about outright speed, but about drivability and raceability. And here's the key issue. Bahrain is actually considered a relatively good circuit for energy harvesting. It has heavy braking zones and multiple acceleration points. If energy management looks complex there, circuits like Melbourne, Monza, Jeddah, or Silverstone, which feature longer full throttle sections and fewer heavy braking events, could exaggerate the problem. That's where the so-called Plan B discussion enters. According to multiple paddock reports, if the opening rounds expose serious race quality concerns, Formula One and the FIA could consider reducing the maximum deployable electrical power during races. Currently, the cap is 350 kilowatts. One proposal, reportedly being discussed, would reduce that by approximately 80 to 200 horsepower equivalent, bringing the electrical contribution closer to 250 kilowatts during race conditions. Let's be clear, this would not eliminate electrification. It would rebalance the power unit toward the internal combustion side and reduce the strain on battery state management. Drivers would spend less time harvesting and more time pushing. But it would also mean admitting that the initial balance may have been too aggressive. From a technical standpoint, reducing electrical deployment would immediately change race dynamics. With less battery reliance, teams would not need to run extreme lift and coast strategies to maintain state of charge. The cars would behave more like traditional high-power machines rather than energy optimization platforms. However, total system power would drop. Estimates suggest the cars could be between 1.5 and 2.5 seconds slower per lap, depending on track characteristics, a significant shift in modern Formula One.
So why is this controversial? Because not all manufacturers are in the same position. If one power unit supplier has optimized its electrical systems more effectively, battery efficiency, harvesting rates, deployment mapping, they may prefer to keep the current rules intact. Mercedes, for example, are widely believed to have invested heavily in electrical architecture. If their system is particularly efficient at managing 350 kilowatt deployment, they would have little incentive to support a major reduction. On the other hand, teams struggling with recharge limitations might benefit from a lower deployment ceiling. There's also another layer. The internal combustion engine output is theoretically around 400 kilowatts, but within that number, small variations matter. If a manufacturer has extracted even 10-20 kilowatts more from the ICE compared to rivals, reducing the electrical share would amplify that advantage. So the politics become complex. Do you reduce electrical power to improve racing quality, or do you preserve the original concept to protect competitive integrity? It's important not to exaggerate the situation. Testing conditions are controlled, fuel loads vary, engine modes are conservative, teams experiment heavily with mapping strategies. As engineers gather real race data, deployment algorithms will improve. Energy management that looks awkward in testing may become optimized and nearly invisible during competitive sessions. Active aerodynamics were introduced partly to offset drag characteristics created by these new power units. The cars are designed to switch between high downforce and low drag modes to compensate for energy management demands. But active aero cannot solve everything. If drivers are lifting significantly earlier into braking zones simply to recharge, that affects overtaking dynamics and race flow. For now, the conversation remains conditional. Nothing changes unless the opening races demonstrate a clear sporting issue. That's why Australia becomes critical. Albert Park is not a heavy recharge circuit. If energy clipping becomes visually obvious there, especially in qualifying, the pressure will increase rapidly. But if teams manage deployment smoothly and racing remains natural, Plan B may remain theoretical. This is not panic, it is contingency planning. Formula One has learned from previous regulation cycles that waiting years to correct obvious issues damages credibility. Having a fallback option prepared, even if never used, demonstrates adaptive governance. At the same time, overreacting too early could unfairly penalize teams that interpreted the regulations correctly. What we know factually is this: drivers have expressed concerns about drivability and energy clipping. Teams are discussing potential deployment reductions if required. Some manufacturers may resist significant changes. No final decision has been made, and the first real stress test comes in Melbourne. The 2026 era represents one of the most ambitious technical resets in Formula One history. Sustainable fuels, simplified hybrid systems, greater electrification, active aerodynamics, and new chassis philosophies. Whenever that much changes at once, friction is inevitable. The real question is whether these early challenges are structural flaws or simply optimization hurdles. If they're optimization hurdles, teams will solve them. If they're structural flaws, Plan B becomes necessary. That decision will not be emotional, it will be data-driven. Race pace deltas, overtaking metrics, energy deployment graphs, and driver telemetry will determine the outcome. The 2026 regulations were always going to challenge engineers. Now we find out whether they also challenge the spectacle. If you enjoyed this deep dive and want clear, fact-based analysis without exaggerated drama, make sure you're subscribed to F1 Grid and hit the like button. The 2026 era is just getting started, and we're going to break down every major technical and political shift as it happens.